we've hit over 70 attendees, so I'm going to start now. Good morning, everyone. My name's Alex Bedford. I'm the Customer and Partnerships Manager here at Zurich Municipal, and welcome to this third webinar in the Zurich Municipal Risk Series. We've previously talked about underinsurance and the Global Risk Report. Today, we're talking about fleet safety and particularly the human factors related to that. A bit of housekeeping, this session is being recorded and you will be sent a link to the session afterwards. I know the first question we always get is, can you send me the slides? But actually we are recording this, so you'll get a link so you can share that, you can watch back after the event should you so wish. You have joined with your cameras and microphones off, but please, through the session, do ask questions or make comments in the chat or the Q&A function at the top of your screen. We will save questions till the end, but be assured that we will be taking note of them as our presenters talk, and we will come to as many as we can once we've reached the end of the formal presentation bit. So in terms of today, we're talking about motor fleet, and we're going to start off with a quick introduction from Alan Thompson, who is one of our motor fleet risk consultants in Zurich Resilience Solutions, with a wealth of experience in this area. And some of you I know will probably have seen him out and about at various other events. And then we are really glad to be joined by Dr. Lisa Dawn, who is the founder of SciDrive, but Lisa is also an associate professor of driver behaviour and the director of the driving research group at Cranfield University. So really interested to hear Lisa's insights through this webinar. So I'm not going to say any more than that, except to reiterate, please do ask questions. We will come to them at the end, or we can always follow up afterwards should we not get to all of your questions. And I will hand over to Alan to start us off through the content. Thank you, Alan.
Thank you, Alex. Good morning, everyone. Welcome to this webinar session this morning. Great pleasure to sort of set this up and run for you, because I think it's so valuable. And it's an opportunity that not many of us get from day to day. So Zurich Resilience Solutions, that's who I work for. That's part of your insurance provision. We're there to support you. We cover, I mean, I'm not going to read the slides to you. I think you're all capable of doing that. We cover a breadth of areas to support your organisations in delivering better performance. If it's not on the list, please still make contact with us, because obviously, you know, we may have good contacts and sort of help you. We've been doing this risk management issue for over 75 years, and many of my colleagues are very, very experienced in this area. But today is principally about motor. So what I'd ask you to do is think about that. Although what I would say to you is what Lisa's going to talk about is equally applicable across so many areas of safety within your organisations. So please don't be blinkered and just think this is purely only for the drivers in your business. Many of the things Lisa will talk about stretch right across it. We're here to support you. Lisa, you know, is sort of someone who I can put you in contact with as well. But we're here to help your business with its safety, sustainability and efficiency, as it says on the business, on the slide in front of you. So from my perspective, I'm trying to get through this quickly because I don't want to eat into Lisa's time. So without any further ado, I'd love to pass you across to Dr. Lisa Dawn, who's going to take you through this webinar this morning. So Lisa, thank you very much.
Thank you. Thanks very much, Alan. That's great. I'm now going to take control of the slides, and very pleased to introduce you to SciDrive. As it's already been said by Alex, that I have two roles. One is as an academic I work at Cranfield University as an associate professor. I've been working in the field of driver behaviour for about 35 years, but I also have my own consultancy in which I'm able to do a lot of things that the university is less interested in as a kind of an educational and research institute. With SciDrive, some of the work that I get involved with is concerned with research with fleet-based, typically, organisations, driver profiling, to administer psychometric assessments for understanding driver behaviour, and also designing interventions for improving road safety across a whole wide range of different types of groups of drivers, but mainly fleet. And I'm also able to provide specialist training for road safety professionals accredited by the Chartered Institute of Ergonomics and Human Factors, and also CPC course, which I'll tell you about in a minute. And, you know, whenever I'm involved in any research concerned with SciDrive, I've got a network of human factors specialists that I can call on and get those projects underway. Here is a very brief sample of some of the work that we're involved with right now. Firstly, Transport for London, working on a large-scale project investigating psychological contributions to pedal application error, also known as pedal confusion or unintended acceleration, where drivers press the wrong pedal, essentially. And what Transport for London were very interested in understanding is, well, how does that happen? What is the disconnect between the brain and the foot, if you like? And, you know, what are the psychological precursors to that? And also recently involved with a large-scale project designing a campaign for the Association of Ambulance Chief Executives, which has gone out to all the ambulance services across the country. And that's to encourage paramedics to safely harness the patients in the back of ambulances, and also, of course, themselves. Unfortunately, there's an ambulance crashing virtually every day, and there have been some pretty unpleasant, high-profile incidents with ambulances, and we need to manage that risk as safely as possible. Dorset Police, we deliver a whole range of different driver diversion courses, from speed awareness through to riding motorcycles safely, dealing with people who've committed an offence and then need to attend some form of road safety education to improve that risk that they've now presented. And so, yeah, there's literally millions of drivers that have been through the courses that I've designed through Dorset Police. With Driver and Vehicle Standards Agency, I've written a book which is an official guide to better driving, and it's now on its 3rd edition. And certainly, even though I don't get royalties, but I hope that you might look at that. It's a really good text that really helps people understand some of the human factors associated with driving and how to manage that risk. Working with Fleet Forum as well, which is an organisation to manage the risks for aid and development workers across the world, and recently involved with a project with Travis Perkins that's just come to an end, looking at bridge strikes and the problems associated with stress when driving for work, and distraction and fatigue, and also skill decay. Some of the issues that you might actually have as local authorities might be that some of your drivers may not drive a lot, and then when they do have to drive, perhaps the skills that they've learned have not actually been practiced sufficiently well to be able to manage the task. So these are some of the very interesting projects that we're involved with, and lots more as well, but that gives you an idea. So I want to talk to you today about the human factor in fleet safety. And the reason I want to talk about that is because typically what organisations think about when they think about the errors that drivers commit is, what they can see, what is at the surface. So when a crash happens, typically investigations focus on what the driver has done wrong, what mistakes have been made, whether or not they follow the rules and procedures, and essentially you can quite easily point to what has gone wrong from the driver's perspective. However, what often is failing to be taken into account is what's underneath that, in terms of what are the gaps within the organisation that has allowed that error to take place. What are the motives for drivers that might actually increase the risk of them committing those kind of errors? Are they motivated by pressure to get the job done as quickly as possible? Are they motivated by some kind of incentive? What are those motives? And essentially, when you think about it in those contexts, you can start to see how it's the systems that are in place within the organisation that actually need to be strengthened, and that's really what we do within SciDrive, is to take as much as possible a systems approach to try and manage those human factors. So what is a systems approach? Well, first of all, what's the evidence for interventions improving fleet safety? What kind of systems do you need to put in place that will actually improve road safety? Because in fact, there are many great interventions that are available, and the question is, which ones work best? And I need to make sure that whenever the advice I'm giving to organisations is there, that it's actually based on the evidence, not something that we think might work or that somebody else has done that worked for them, but will it actually work for the organisations we're working with? And then within those systems, whether or not crashes have been adequately investigated and whether or not the lessons from those investigations have been shared. In other words, what went wrong? What could be done to actually improve the situation? So, for example, if you're having multiple incident-involved drivers that are continually getting involved in collisions, what does that say about what's happening within the organisation that allows that to continue, and what can be done to improve recruitment and induction programs, what can be done for ensuring that the multiple incident involved drivers are actually being managed in a way that is going to reduce that risk. So what systems are in place, rather than just get rid of people who then go on to other organisations and cause the same problem potentially. What can be done from a fleet and driver behaviour perspective? Can we rely on fleet drivers to follow the instructions and policies and all the traffic rules, when they're not being observed, when there is some, failure on the part of the organisation to actually monitor what drivers are doing? And this is one of the reasons why I will talk about telematics shortly, because that's one way in which you can monitor drivers on a day-to-day basis and understand what risk you're carrying. And finally, what systems need to be in place for behavioural change? How can we structure those systems to manage the risk that we've identified through the collisions that are taking place? Because from a kind of a safety culture perspective, one of the things that really is an issue emerging more and more within the organisations that I talk to is that often there are very conflicting messages around safety, because what can happen is that managers say you know, you mustn't speed, you mustn't commit offences, you mustn't use your mobile phone, you mustn't do all these things. But actually, at the same time, workloads are really high. People are under an enormous amount of stress and pressure to complete a task. And, you know, so it's kind of like, well, what do we do? Do we respond to the pressure, or do we do safety? And so often people are motivated by doing the job as well as they can, because they want to make sure that they are safe and secure within their employment. And, you know, what are the consequences if they're running late? Does the boss start to ask questions? And, you know, what kind of pressure does that put on a driver for taking those risks? And certainly, you know, in terms of working practices, you know, we've seen and interviewed literally hundreds, if not thousands, of drivers now, and we hear these stories about, you know, how they feel with regards to their workload. And, you know, they tell you you're going to do a 48-hour week, but you don't. It's 60 hours one week and 34 the next, but on average, it's, you know, some weeks are really, really tough and difficult to get through, especially if people are ill or on holiday and people are having to work overtime. And, you know, it's very high workload for some individuals. And what can also happen, some of the work that we've done looking at safety culture, is you start to understand that people kind of often carry some resentment and have some quite negative attitudes towards management, because they feel that there's a real disconnect between what they say and what they do. They preach health and safety, but they don't follow it through. It's health and safety as long as the rules apply to them. It's your fault if things go wrong. It's not anything to do with the systems or the organisation. And so really, you know, it's clear that when you have spent as long as I have looking into this topic, that there are some messages coming through loud and clear about, you know, what kind of organisations are doing to actually increase the risk of human error amongst their driving workforce. So I've talked a little bit about safety culture. Let's just look at some of the evidence around safety culture and some of the ways in which it's been described. And this is work by Hudson, 2007. It's referred to as a safety ladder. And it really gives us a very clear understanding about the different categories of safety culture that you can see across a whole range of different fleet-based organisations. And at the very bottom of the ladder, if you like, is the pathological safety culture. And typically when we've interviewed drivers and managers and supervisors within fleet-based organisations, you kind of hear that pathological stance when people say things like, who cares as long as we're not caught? Who cares about safety? It's fine because it doesn't have any repercussions to us. So clearly that's very pathological, and you can imagine that we see a lot of crashes when within organisations that are described as pathological. And then we move up to reactive, and to be honest, most of the organisations that we see on a day-to-day basis tend to fit within this category, the reactive category, where they would say that safety is important. We do a lot every time we have an accident. You know, it kind of comes to mind the idea of the horse and the stable kind of analogy. The horse has bolted. Oh, we didn't realise that was a risk. We better go and do something about that. As opposed to calculative, where often it's around, you know, looking at making sure that the systems are safe, that they are strong, and that there are not too many gaps in those systems, and they've learned from some of the mistakes that they've made. Whereas the proactive, much more advanced in terms of safety, tend to kind of try and look for things that might become a risk. And this is kind of typical amongst the very high risk industries like petroleum and gas industries and pharmaceuticals, those kind of organizations. And then generative culture, which is safety is just how they do things around here, and where it's a very, very high priority. And you know, what we see typically is that organizations that are transporting dangerous goods like oil, fuel tankers, those kind of things, they typically have a 75% lower risk of being involved in a crash than other organizations that are not transporting dangerous goods. So we know that there's a real strong focus there. Okay, now we're going to do a poll, because thinking about these relatively enduring, stable and resistant to change kind of cultures that have these formal safety rules and procedures, you know, we also need to think about the leadership and commitment from the leaders, and about how safety is being valued and that willingness to learn from errors. So the first poll is for you to think about your organization or organizations that you work with. And typically what we're looking at is, you know, how would you rank your clients according to the safety culture level, or your organization? Would you place it at pathological, reactive, calculative, proactive, or generative? And then there's kind of two polls in one here, thinking about what you think, and then think about how those companies would rank themselves, because typically there is a disconnect between what people think about their own organization and what other people might think about them. So have a think about that. Based on your experience, how would you rank the same companies according to their safety culture? And then we'll just allow a few seconds for you to vote here, and then we'll view that. So just 30 seconds. Okay, we've got about 80 or so responses now. Perhaps I could view that poll. Okay. So how would your clients rank their own companies according to safety culture level? Mostly they would categorize their company as reactive. Okay. So what about the second poll then? The second poll, yes. So now we're starting to see a little bit of a shift in people's thoughts. You're starting to see that there's a kind of a more of a move towards calculative. Yeah. Okay, so it's interesting how people kind of imagine where their organization would sit, and also what other people believe, because we can be quite biased in our opinions, and I think that's an interesting observation there. Okay, so we've kind of considered this notion about safety culture and where you might sit as an organization. So what can be done about it? Well, we do need to think about some of the interventions that would really help to manage some of the risks that we see for the driving workforce in your workplace. So what kind of fleet safety interventions is a way to go in terms of managing human error and managing the risks of driving for work? Well, the first thing to say is that actually most organizations will consider that the best way of managing risk is to have people take part in some kind of in-vehicle driving course where they're learning some skills. Perhaps they have a driving instructor next to them pointing out, you know, the road signs and what they need to do and how they need to steer and when they need to brake and what kind of speed they need to adopt in certain situations. And actually, in terms of all the evidence and, you know, certainly some of the studies that have been conducted, and there are literally hundreds of them. And over all of those studies, and there have been 300,000 participants in some of these studies, have found, without exception virtually, that there is no benefit for in-vehicle driver training in terms of reducing crash risk. Now, that might be a bit of a surprise to people. And, you know, just to say that, of course, it's absolutely critical that people are fully trained to make sure that they're properly licensed. But that training in itself is geared towards acquiring a license rather than what happens after they've been trained. Because what tends to happen is that people drive when they're distracted, they use their mobile phones, they maybe are fatigued, perhaps they get annoyed and frustrated, perhaps they don't wear their seat belts. There's a whole range of different behaviours that emerge after training that actually are the reasons why people crash. So that brings me on to the next poll then, which is, what's the best method for increasing compliance with policies and procedures? So what would you say is the best method? We've got here a number of potential areas that you could vote for: disciplinary actions, making people pay some kind of fines like an excess on the insurance claim, a written warning, a remedial assessment or training, or telematics-based solutions and coaching. Okay, so just a few seconds for you to respond to that poll then. Okay, so we're getting sort of 90 odd responses there so far, and I think that gives us a good indication of where people are starting to kind of be cohesive around the responses there, and that is that telematics-based solutions and coaching is coming through quite strongly at 54% there. And you're absolutely right. That is, from the evidence, the best way forward. Disciplinary actions, obviously, you know, you will need to go through those disciplinary actions, but it won't necessarily change behaviour. And it can create resentment, and it doesn't deal with the problem. Fines, paying excesses, unfortunately, that tends to lead to underreporting of incidents, which doesn't help the organisation to manage safety at all. And, you know, remedial assessment and training, you know, it's certainly something that could identify some problems, but often what people do is they give you a perfect drive when they're being observed, and it may not actually reveal some of the issues that are more of a risk than you can imagine. Okay, thanks for that. So moving on then, I would like to talk about telematics-based solutions and coaching, because, as you said, overwhelmingly, the evidence is there that it is a good method of ensuring that drivers not only are being monitored, as I said earlier, but also that they are given feedback on their performance, that they are able to monitor themselves. And also, because you're collecting data, you have the opportunity for a trained coach to actually deliver that feedback and help them, support them in designing the kind of interventions that you need to put in place to target some of the ways in which they can improve their risk. So they can self-monitor, the supervisor can observe and give feedback. And certainly in terms of the evidence, that combination of feedback and coaching really does seem to, on average, reduce the number of people involved in crashes by about 20 to 30%, depending on the study that you look at. So clearly important to do evidence-based interventions as much as possible. So how do you develop a positive safety culture? We've talked about safety culture. Clearly putting in place something like telematics starts that kind of trajectory towards safety. But what you also need to do is to think about the human factor. You need to think about getting people to talk about their safety concerns, getting people to essentially own the safety problem themselves and not just be something that is determined by people around them, but that they have a part to play in that. In fact, the people that are doing the job day in, day out, they will know what the gaps are within the safety systems. So just literally asking them to talk about what they think could be done to manage safety is a really excellent way of identifying those gaps, and also gets people to buy into the process and helps to improve their motivation to be safer in the workplace. And one of the areas that really can help as well to develop safer motives and also improve safety culture is called insight training. Insight training is very much a theory-driven approach. It's based on very old evidence around how when you get people together in a room to talk about safety, it's a real force for behavioural change as opposed to delivering a kind of a lecture. You're able also to work with the group to design the goals for safety using all the evidence from goal setting theory, getting people to develop an insight about their own personal strengths and weaknesses as a driver, and focus on what they need to do, what kind of action plan they need to put together. And everybody feels like they're in it together. And that's really the best way forward for developing a safer culture. And here, just looking at these three areas where everyone contributes, it's not just something driven by supervisors or managers, it's something that everybody is committed to. And having that kind of commitment for safety helps employees feel that connection to their organisation where they want to be involved. And of course, we can't say enough about the importance of having the leaders that are the first port of call for workers who look to leaders for deciding on what is the best way forward for them. And leaders being involved in safety is so important. Because if they listen to the workforce and understand what needs to be done, and that they take that as important and needs to be prioritised, then that's really going to massively help improve the safety culture. And also that employees then feel empowered to actually have a voice and have a say within the organisation. So one of the ways that we can do that is I've taken all of the sort of good crown jewels, if you like, out of some of the evidence and put together a 7-hour CPC accredited module 1, which looks at driver behaviour, and module 2, which looks at how to change driver behaviour, taking into account understanding what the safety system gaps are, and then putting that report through to the managers, utilising a whole range of different strategies and behaviour change techniques within this CPC that it will encourage safer working practices, and including changing people's motives for safety, developing their insights on their own driving strengths and weaknesses, and looking at the strategies for safer driving. What do they need to do? What are the behaviours that they need to develop? And what are the barriers that might get in the way of safer driving? And, you know, what actions need to be planned? And essentially, one of the components of the CPC is the profiling, individualistic profiles, where people complete this profile online. They're able to see where they sit relative to a large benchmark of fleet-based drivers, and understand, you know, the safety management, the perspective, there's perspective on the safety management within their organisation. You know, do they see it as being very lenient, or do they see it as being very rigorous? And you know, how vulnerable are they to fatigue? How likely are they to get angry when they're driving for work? How susceptible are they to time pressure, and so on? And that really helps them to identify some of the things that they can do to manage their own personal risk, as well as understand the organisational systems that contribute to that risk. So if you'd like to find out more about some of these areas, I'd encourage you to join me for the accredited course that I mentioned at the beginning by the Chartered Institute of Ergonomics and Human Factors. It's a 2-day online course, and I will cover all these various modules to help you understand a bit more about each of these very important areas for developing a safety culture and understanding driver behaviour at the workplace, looking at safe systems, human error, human performance, fatigue and workload, and what are some of the strategies you can do to manage risk for level 1. And then for level 2, looking at motives in much more detail, some of the emotions that affect driver behaviour, the problems associated with stress, life stress, work stress, driver stress, looking at individual differences. Why do people differ? What makes them different in the way that they think about safety? And some behaviour change techniques that you can use to improve your safety in your organisation. So these are some of the dates coming through in June and July, and also there's dates in September, and level 2 in April next, and in September. All right, well, thank you very much. I look forward to hearing your questions, and over to you, Alex, I think.
No, thanks, Lisa. Thanks very much for that.
Okay.
Insight. That's all right. If you have any questions, please put them in the chat and populate that for me. But in the meantime, Lisa, I mean, one of the most regular pieces of feedback that we get when we speak to fleet managers and other managers across organisations is that basically well, crashes are going to happen. So, you know, we can't prevent them. So, you know, what can we do other than just report it and then move on to the next one? How would you respond to that?
Well, yeah, sorry, I'm sort of staggered, but you know, the fact that that happens still today is incredible, isn't it? But it is, when you've been working in this field for as long as we have, it's clear that you know the difference between those organisations that just throw their arms up and say, well, you know, there's nothing we can do about it. And of course, what you see is the perpetual problem, and nothing changes. They often are at that pathological level where there's a high crash risk that they carry. Often, in my experience, things change when there's a fatality, or when the costs are so high that someone involved at the senior level will say, what's going on? This needs to be sorted. Otherwise, it's just left to its own devices and it only gets worse. So it's clear from all the cases that we've been involved with that there is a lot that can be done. And, some of these strategies, you would see an immediate benefit. Of course, as with any behaviour, you can't expect there to be a kind of a one-off event and everything to change forever. It's something that you need to keep on top of on a regular basis, and certainly, you can see some incredibly successful cases where they've done exactly that and managed to dramatically reduce their risk of crashes.
Thanks for that, Lisa. One of the other things that I found particularly interesting when we looked at the poll there was this probably this misconception around, or what the difference would be between an SLT, for example, describing what their cultures is within the organisation, their safety culture, and then how that would be probably reported by people lower down the food chain, effectively the drivers, even some supervisors, So what do you think is probably one of the really key ways of actually engaging with that?
I think it's about managers being willing to listen to bad news, really. I think often there is the gap between what happens on the ground and what managers think is happening. And, a pivotal role here is the supervisor. How the supervisor engages with the driver, how the supervisor engages with management, because often they become the kind of go-between here, and they have a very strong influence on driver behaviour and what managers think. So often, we found that supervisors drive the safety culture, and some of the interventions we put in place in the past is to actually improve supervisors' awareness of the importance of their role, managing drivers, making sure that they take on board drivers' concerns and that they communicate well to managers as well, and be honest and open and accountable about what's really going on.
Yeah, I couldn't agree with you more. I think one of the other things, and one of the key ones that you spoke about there, was enforcement. One of the slides was headed enforcement, and we see sort of two ends of the spectrum, really. We see, as I said there, crashes happen, we just let them, report them to the insurer and then move on. To the other end, we're actually 3 strikes and you're out, effectively. How would you say an organisation should approach what I would class as as we call them, errors and violations? What is the best way?
Okay, yeah, it's a good question, because when you're talking about drivers that are repeatedly having incidents, I don't want to call them offenders because they're not offenders. They are people who are committing errors typically. Now, if there's an intentionality towards that error, like they know they're doing something wrong, they're excessively speeding, they're using their mobile phone, they're not wearing their seatbelts, all of these sorts of non-compliant behaviours, if you like. It is up to the organisation to make sure they have a system in place to catch that, which is one of the reasons why telematics is important. But there needs to be also a kind of a carrot and stick here, because you can't expect for drivers who are repeatedly breaking the speed limits to be, you know, essentially nothing done about them. I'm not suggesting that for 1 minute. But, you know, equally, we shouldn't be penalising people for committing a genuine error. We should be supporting those people and helping them to reduce the risk of that error, and of course focusing on the systems. So having a kind of a, you know, verbal warning, written warning kind of process where people are given every opportunity before you start down that route of disciplinary proceedings, and if they're still not responding to your you know, systems for improving that performance, then there is no choice but to go down the disciplinary route. Because actually, although in my experience, what tends to happen is when you start going down that disciplinary route, they tend to leave anyway. But it then becomes a problem for another organisation. So that's why I'm very keen that they are supported as much as possible for improvement before you start the disciplinary proceeding.
Yeah, thanks, Lisa. One of the questions that's come in from Oliver, thanks, Oliver, is around one of the problems that organisations have in not moving down the telematics line is regards to data privacy, data protection issues. And have you ever been challenged on that before? And if so, how do we manage that, as you know, to move forward?
Yeah, it's a good question. And, you know, I've worked a lot with the police, you know, and, you know, they are clearly quite concerned about the potential for privacy when they are on pursuits and response calls and something goes wrong. And actually, what they found when it has been piloted is that you've now got evidence of what actually happened, because there are many cases where they have been, you know, misrepresented. And so actually telematics, when you pilot it and drivers start to see the benefit to them personally, they do get on board. But certainly another way through this is through working with the unions, making sure that they feel comfortable, that it is about duty of care, that we are trying to manage their safety at work. And so telematics is a way of doing that, rather than it be a spy in the cab. It's more about, you know, trying to keep them as safe as possible when they're at work.
I think also, Lisa, you know, and I think there's also a balance, isn't it? Because let's remember that the organisation has a responsibility as well to be able to ensure that that vehicle is being driven appropriately.
Yeah.
And they will be held to account if they don't do anything about it. So there is a balance, and you know, this issue of data protection I've seen thrown up quite a few times for organisations. And actually, you know, I don't think there is particularly an issue there. It's actually about making sure that when that vehicle is being driven for business purposes, you have the right system to actually deliver what you need to be able to answer those questions.
Yeah.
I think sometimes organisations will move down a whole raft of different ways that actually go way beyond what they need to know to understand and safely manage that operation.
Yeah.
So I think, you know, what you're saying, absolutely spot on. And also, you know, an organisation needs to understand what it needs to deliver through its telematics solution. So yeah, thanks, Oliver. A really interesting one there. Then there's one from Mike who sort of says, what documentation would you expect to see as part of induction for staff who drive for work? And what about a random drink drugs testing policy? So 2 questions in one. So
that's okay. Well, the second one's easy. What are your thoughts? Well, I think they're a good thing. You know, so there's plenty of case studies I've seen where it's led to drivers being much more conscientious about these things. So I think random testing is a good is a good thing. What documentation would you expect to see as part of induction for staff who drive for work? Well, unfortunately, in my experience, and I'm sure in yours, Alan, often what induction involves is a policy that drivers are expected to sign, and that is the nature of their induction. That's usually all they ever have. I remember 15, 20 years ago working with the pharmaceutical industry to design an induction program, which was a week long on travel safety, where we had new recruits, sales reps essentially selling medical products up and down the country, who were achieving targets, but actually losing all that money in terms of writing off vehicles. So the management thought, well, hang on a minute, you're coming in, you've been recruited for your kind of aggressive, sales pitches, but actually that also makes you a very high risk driver. So we spent about a week with them, really getting people to be fully aware of, the risks of driving too fast and so on. Had a huge impact on their safety compared with previous cohorts of new recruits. So, it's not sufficient to just have new recruits sign a policy. Induction should be much more than that. At the very least, a regular, ongoing period, because we know that when people, especially when they're newly licensed, we know that there's a tendency for complacency to sit in, where people, after a few weeks at the job, start to become more at risk. So those early weeks are very important to make sure induction is not just a one-off, but a regular kind of process.
I couldn't agree more. I mean, with regard to the drug and alcohol policy, personally, I don't see any reason why any organisation that has, I mean, this goes right across the whole spectrum of health and safety. And the issue with vehicles is exactly the same as operating, high risk machinery. So therefore, as an organisation, you have a duty to actually ensure that your people are safe to actually use it. With regard to what documentation would I probably like to see moving forward, anything that shows that, one, the driver understands what it is expected of them, what's the standard that's expected of them. Secondly, what's the competence level of this person, and what are you doing to make sure that they can deliver at your standard? Yeah. So personally, I think it's anything to sort of that meets those targets, and whatever the organisation sees as fit. Yeah. But I think there's another one here from George that says, what can be done to manage safety in the education sector? For example, school minibuses.
Yes, that's an important one as well, isn't it? Because that's a clear potential risk. Well, first thing is make sure that the drivers that are driving those minibuses are fully experienced and qualified for the role, because it's not sufficient for these drivers to have had, just because they're able to drive a minibus doesn't necessarily mean that they are fit and competent to be able to do so. Certainly, profiling drivers, making sure that they understand and are risk aware, and that they are fully fit and competent to drive is clearly important. Now, I mentioned the workshop in my session there. It just as much as it's available for CPC, it's also available for any drivers. I have a raft of behavioural coaches that can deliver that session, so I would recommend some form of insight training to get people to really become aware of their own contributions to risk, as well as understanding the workplace issues as well. And I also see there's a question here about can non-Zurich policy holders look into side drive? So, yes, you can.
Yeah, I mean, just kind of adding to what you said there in response to George's question. I mean, the minibuses, school minibuses are particularly one of the hot topics. You know, we're transporting in many cases the most vulnerable in society. And many of those minibuses are being used to transport people who have SEN, so potentially behavioural problems as well. So actually making sure that that's properly risk assessed, risk managed, but even at the far extreme cases, that the driver is actually competent to transport those young people is so critical to every operation. So George, I have a lot of sympathy with what you're saying there. You know, and it is a high risk activity. So from my perspective, I just think that we need to focus on those things and the Section 19 permits and things like that. Some people are sort of putting into the chat with regard to they're struggling to adopt a drug and alcohol testing because of HR and union resistance. Have you got any tips for sort of overcoming those problems, Lisa, at all in your thinking?
Yeah, I mean, you know, I remember working with a national bus company on this very thing, and we really did find there was a kind of a backlash from the unions, but you know, we just kept those channels of communication open, and you know, really about educating the unions about the risks to their members, you know, and I would just say, just keep going, because you know, eventually, if you can get the right balance in those meetings that you have with the unions, never miss an opportunity to express the concerns around the increased use of drugs in driving. You know, pretty soon you're going to have a roadside drug testing intervention coming in, so it's important that you know, the people that are in your organization are not caught in that kind of roadside intervention.
I think even moving on from that, Liz, as you quite rightly say, one of the ways that I've dealt with this in a practical way was to actually offer to train HR and union representatives at the outset first, so that they can actually monitor how this is then embedded and then rolled out across any organisation, and making sure that you know, for example, there are proper amnesty periods in place. This is a wellbeing intervention as much as anything else. And HR, you know, there are CIPD rules, guidance to actually support rolling these programs out. So please look on the CIPD website. They've got documents there that support it. They've done research as well. So it's all there. It's all there to support us with rolling this out. And I can tell you, any union, every union, shall I say, if you go onto their central websites, all support rolling out a robust policy, as long as it's backed in the right way with HR and a proper wellbeing program to support it. So please don't be put off. Be, as Lisa says, be resilient and keep pushing. It's worth it in the long run. But thank you ever so much, everyone. We're coming to the end of our time. Please, from my perspective, I'd like to thank Lisa for everything that you've gone through this morning, Lisa, and your time. And please get in contact if you need anything else. So thanks ever so much for your time, everyone.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, everyone.